The scorching Afghan sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky terrain as Master Chief Petty Officer Marcus Ghost Rodriguez adjusted his rifle scope one final time. The Taliban compound lay sprawled across the valley below like a venomous snake coiled in wait. For 3 days, his team had been tracking a high-value target through these unforgiving mountains, following intelligence that could change the course of their mission in this godforsaken corner of Helmand Province. Marcus had earned his nickname honestly during his 15 years with the Navy SEALs. He moved through enemy territory like a phantom, appearing and disappearing without a trace. His teammates often joked that he could walk through a minefield wearing tap shoes and never trigger a single explosion. But today felt different. Something in the air whispered of danger, of plans gone wrong, of the kind of chaos that turned heroes into memories. The mission briefing had been straightforward enough. Extract Abdul Hassan, a Taliban commander with intimate knowledge of upcoming attacks on American forces. Intelligence suggested he was hiding in the compound with minimal security, planning to move locations within hours. Time was running short, and failure wasn't an option. Marcus had led dozens of similar operations, each one adding another layer to his legend among the special operations community. His team consisted of 5 other elite operators, each one handpicked for their unique skills. There was Jake Bulldog Thompson, a demolitions expert who could level a building or delicately remove a door lock with equal precision. Tommy Eagle Eye Santos served as their sniper, capable of threading a needle at 800 yards. David Tank Williams handled heavy weapons and had the kind of physical presence that made enemies think twice about engaging. Michael Doc Patterson was their medic, a man who had saved more lives than most doctors see in a lifetime. Finally, there was Chris Silent Johnson, their communications specialist who could tap into enemy frequencies faster than most people could dial a phone. As they descended into the valley under cover of darkness, Marcus felt the familiar rush of adrenaline mixed with calculated calm that had kept him alive through countless missions. The plan was simple and clean. They would approach from the north, neutralize any sentries silently, locate Hassan, and extract him before dawn broke over the mountains. Everything had been rehearsed, every contingency planned for, every escape route memorized. The compound appeared exactly as their satellite imagery had shown. Mud brick walls surrounded a cluster of low buildings with 2 guard towers positioned at opposite corners. Marcus could see the faint glow of cigarettes in the darkness, confirming the presence of sentries. Through his night vision goggles, he counted at least 6 hostiles, though he suspected more lurked inside the buildings. Silent moved first, his knife finding its mark with deadly precision as the nearest sentry crumpled without a sound. Eagle Eye took out the tower guard with a suppressed rifle shot that barely whispered through the night air. One by one, the outer defenses fell to the team's coordinated assault. Everything was going according to plan, perhaps too smoothly for Marcus's liking. His instincts, honed by years of combat, screamed that something was wrong. They breached the main building exactly as rehearsed. Tank planted charges on the reinforced door while Bulldog prepared flashbang grenades to disorient anyone inside. Doc positioned himself to provide covering fire while Silent monitored enemy communications. Marcus led the entry, his weapon trained on every shadow, every corner where death might be waiting. The interior of the building revealed a maze of narrow corridors and small rooms. Intelligence had indicated Hassan would be in the eastern wing, likely in the largest room that served as his temporary headquarters. As they moved through the structure, Marcus noticed details that didn't match their briefings. The walls showed recent repairs, the floors were cleaner than expected, and there were too many personal belongings scattered about for a temporary hideout. They found Hassan exactly where intelligence had predicted, sitting behind a wooden desk as if he had been waiting for them. The man looked up with an expression that chilled Marcus to the bone. It wasn't fear or surprise, but something far more unsettling: satisfaction. Hassan smiled, a cold expression that spoke of knowledge and preparation. In that moment, Marcus realized they had walked into something much more dangerous than a simple extraction mission. Hassan spoke in perfect English, his voice carrying an accent that suggested education far beyond what his file indicated. He told them they were expected, that every step of their approach had been monitored and reported. The Taliban commander explained how easy it had been to feed false intelligence to American forces, How simple it was to lure their best operators into a carefully prepared trap. As Hassan's words sank in, Marcus heard the distinctive sound of vehicles approaching fast. Multiple engines, heavy trucks, and the unmistakable rumble of armored vehicles. Through the windows he could see muzzle flashes in the darkness as enemy fighters took positions around the compound. The extraction point they had planned to use was now crawling with hostiles, and their planned escape routes had been compromised. Silent's radio crackled with urgent transmissions as he tried to reach their support team. The responses he received painted a grim picture. Enemy forces had surrounded the entire area, cutting off all avenues of retreat. Air support was 20 minutes out, far too long given their current situation. They were trapped, outnumbered, and facing an enemy that had prepared specifically for their arrival. Marcus made the decision that would define the next phase of his life. Rather than attempting to fight their way out immediately, he ordered his team to establish a defensive position within the compound. They had enough ammunition and explosives to hold off a significant force, but only if they chose their positions carefully and made every shot count. The first wave of attackers came just as the eastern sky began to show the faintest hint of dawn. Marcus and his team had positioned themselves strategically throughout the compound, turning Hassan's trap into their own fortress. Each man knew his role. Each understood that their survival depended on perfect coordination and unwavering determination. The battle that followed would become the stuff of legend, a story told in hushed tones throughout the special operations community. But as the first bullets began to fly and the compound filled with the smoke of battle, Marcus had no way of knowing that this fight would push him beyond every limit he thought he possessed, testing not just his skills as a warrior, but his very will to survive. The first wave hit them like a tsunami of violence. Taliban fighters poured into the compound from 3 directions, their war cries echoing off the mud brick walls as automatic weapons fire erupted throughout the complex. Marcus pressed himself against the concrete barrier he had chosen as cover, feeling chunks of masonry explode around him as enemy bullets found their mark. Eagle Eye had positioned himself in the 2nd floor of the main building, his sniper rifle picking off targets with methodical precision. Each shot dropped an enemy fighter, but for every man that fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. The Taliban had brought significant numbers to this fight, clearly intending to overwhelm the SEAL team through sheer force rather than tactical finesse. Bulldog's explosives began their deadly work as the first group of attackers reached the compound's main courtyard. His carefully placed charges detonated in sequence, creating a wall of fire and shrapnel that temporarily halted the enemy advance. But Marcus knew they were only buying time. The Taliban had planned this ambush too carefully to be deterred by initial casualties. Doc had taken position near the compound's medical station, where he could provide covering fire while remaining ready to treat wounded team members. His rifle barked steadily as enemy fighters attempted to flank their position from the southern wall. Tank had established himself at the main entrance, his heavy machine gun creating a devastating field of fire that prevented the enemy from mounting a coordinated assault. Silent worked frantically with his communications equipment, trying to coordinate with air support, while maintaining contact with their command structure. The radio chatter painted an increasingly desperate picture. Enemy forces had established anti-aircraft positions throughout the valley, making helicopter extraction extremely dangerous. Fast-moving jets could provide close air support, but only if the team could maintain their position long enough for the aircraft to arrive. Hassan remained in his chair throughout the initial assault, his expression one of calm satisfaction as he watched the battle unfold around him. Marcus realized the Taliban commander was far more than a simple target. This was a man who had orchestrated the entire scenario, from the false intelligence that had lured them here to the overwhelming force now trying to destroy them. The second wave of attackers approached with more caution and better coordination. These weren't the enthusiastic but poorly trained fighters who had led the initial assault. Marcus could see disciplined movement patterns, proper use of cover, and tactical communication that suggested professional military training. The Taliban had brought their best fighters for this engagement. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded against the wall where Tank had positioned his machine gun, filling the air with dust and debris. When the smoke cleared, Tank was down, blood streaming from a head wound that had rendered him unconscious. Doc immediately moved to help his fallen teammate, dragging Tank to better cover while maintaining suppressing fire with his sidearm. Eagle Eye's voice crackled over their communication system, reporting enemy movement on the eastern wall. A squad of fighters was attempting to breach their perimeter, using the same route the SEAL team had used to enter the compound. Marcus shifted position to counter this new threat, knowing that if the enemy gained a foothold inside their defensive perimeter, the battle would be over quickly. The fighting continued throughout the morning as the sun climbed higher in the Afghan sky. Each member of the team was running low on ammunition, and their carefully planned defensive positions were slowly being compromised by the relentless enemy assault. Marcus counted at least 40 enemy fighters, with more arriving as word of the battle spread throughout the region. Bulldog attempted to even the odds by detonating his remaining explosives near the compound's main gate, creating a massive explosion that temporarily silenced the enemy guns. But the respite was brief, and when the smoke cleared, Marcus could see fresh fighters moving into position. The Taliban seemed to have an endless supply of men willing to die for the chance to kill American Special Operations Forces. Doc worked heroically to keep Tank alive while continuing to fight. The medic had already used most of his supplies treating his teammates' injuries, but Tank remained unconscious and was losing blood at an alarming rate. Without immediate medical evacuation, the big man wouldn't survive much longer. Silent finally received word that air support was approaching, but the news came with devastating complications. The enemy's anti-aircraft positions were too well established for helicopter extraction. The jets could provide close air support, but the team would need to mark their position clearly and find a way to reach the extraction zone on foot. Marcus made the difficult decision to begin planning their breakout from the compound. They couldn't hold their position indefinitely, and Tank needed medical attention that Doc couldn't provide with their limited resources. But moving through enemy-controlled territory while carrying a wounded teammate would be nearly impossible, especially with their ammunition running dangerously low. The third major assault came just after noon, when the temperature inside the compound had reached unbearable levels. This time, the Taliban coordinated their attack with mortars, forcing the SEAL team to abandon some of their carefully prepared positions. Marcus felt hot metal fragment tear through his left shoulder as he moved to a new position, but he ignored the pain and continued fighting. Eagle Eye had been forced to relocate twice as enemy fighters attempted to storm his elevated position. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, and he reported that his rifle scope had been damaged by shrapnel. The sniper's devastating accuracy had been one of their primary advantages, and losing his effectiveness would make their situation even more desperate. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus began to understand the true scope of the trap they had walked into. This wasn't just an ambush designed to capture or kill a SEAL team. Hassan and his commanders had orchestrated something much larger, creating a propaganda victory that would demonstrate Taliban ability to defeat America's most elite forces. The Taliban fighters showed no sign of backing down despite their heavy casualties. Fresh reinforcements continued to arrive, and Marcus could see enemy commanders positioning their forces for what appeared to be a final, overwhelming assault. His team had fought brilliantly, inflicting casualties that far exceeded their own numbers. But courage and skill could only accomplish so much against such overwhelming odds. Tank regained consciousness briefly, his eyes focusing on Marcus with characteristic determination. Despite his injuries, the big man tried to pick up his weapon and return to the fight. Doc pushed him back down, explaining that he needed to conserve his strength for the evacuation they hoped was still possible. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Marcus realized they were facing their darkest hour. Air support remained minutes away, their ammunition was nearly exhausted, and the enemy was preparing for a final assault that would likely overwhelm their defenses. But somewhere deep inside, the warrior spirit that had carried him through 15 years of special operations refused to accept defeat. The fourth assault began with a sustained mortar barrage that shook the very foundations of the compound. Marcus pressed himself against the crumbling wall as explosions erupted around him, each blast sending deadly fragments of concrete and metal whistling through the air. The Taliban had clearly decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. They intended to level the entire compound with their target still inside. Eagle Eye's position took a direct hit, the upper floor collapsing in a cloud of dust and debris. Marcus watched in horror as his sniper disappeared beneath tons of rubble. For several agonizing seconds, there was no movement from the collapsed section. Then incredibly, Eagle Eye emerged from the wreckage, blood streaming down his face but still clutching his damaged rifle. The man's determination epitomized everything Marcus loved about his team. Tank had slipped back into unconsciousness, his breathing becoming increasingly labored despite Doc's heroic efforts to keep him stable. The medic had exhausted his supply of bandages and was now using torn pieces of clothing to stem the bleeding from multiple shrapnel wounds. Without proper surgical intervention, Tank wouldn't survive another hour. Bulldog had managed to rig several improvised explosive devices using materials salvaged from the compound, but his supply of conventional demolition charges was completely exhausted. The explosives expert was now fighting with a captured AK-47, having run out of ammunition for his primary weapon. His improvised bombs had accounted for at least a dozen enemy casualties, but the Taliban seemed to have an endless supply of replacement fighters. Silent continued his desperate attempts to coordinate with air support while simultaneously monitoring enemy communications. The intelligence he was gathering painted an increasingly grim picture. Taliban forces throughout the region were converging on their position, drawn by radio reports of the ongoing battle. What had started as an ambush was rapidly evolving into something much larger and more dangerous. The enemy's final assault came with the methodical precision of a military operation rather than the enthusiastic chaos of their earlier attacks. Marcus watched through his rifle scope as Taliban fighters advanced under covering fire, using proper military tactics that suggested extensive training. These weren't the usual insurgent forces they had faced in previous engagements. Hassan finally moved from his chair, producing a radio from beneath his desk and speaking rapidly in what Marcus recognized as Pashto. The Taliban commander was clearly coordinating the assault, directing his fighters with the expertise of a trained military officer. Marcus began to understand that they had stumbled into something far more significant than a simple extraction mission. Enemy fighters breached their perimeter at 2 locations simultaneously, forcing Marcus to make impossible decisions about where to deploy his remaining resources. He ordered Eagle Eye to abandon his elevated position and join the defense of the main courtyard, while Bulldog moved to counter the breach on the eastern wall. Each movement exposed them to additional enemy fire, but maintaining their defensive positions was no longer possible. The fighting in the courtyard became intensely personal as Taliban fighters closed to within meters of the SEAL team's positions. Marcus found himself engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a bearded fighter who wielded a curved knife with deadly skill. The struggle lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity as the 2 warriors tested their training and determination against each other. Doc was forced to abandon his medical duties and rejoin the fight as enemy forces threatened to overrun Tank's position. The medic's rifle spoke with deadly accuracy as he protected his unconscious teammate, but Marcus could see the strain wearing on the man's face. They were asking Doc to be both warrior and healer simultaneously, an impossible burden under any circumstances. Silence equipment took a direct hit from a rocket-propelled grenade, severing their communication with air support at the worst possible moment. The communications specialist immediately began working to repair the damage, but the specialized electronic components couldn't be fixed with the tools available in the compound. They were now completely isolated, fighting for their lives without any hope of outside assistance. Eagle Eye had managed to find an elevated position in the compound's water tower, giving him a clear view of the approaching enemy forces. Despite his damaged scope, the sniper began picking off Taliban commanders, disrupting their coordination and buying precious time for his teammates. Each shot represented a victory against impossible odds, but Marcus knew they couldn't sustain this level of combat much longer. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Marcus realized their ammunition situation had become critical. Each member of his team was down to their final magazines, and there were no resupply options available. They had scavenged some enemy weapons and ammunition, but the quality was poor and the quantities insufficient for sustained combat. Tank briefly regained consciousness, his eyes finding Marcus with remarkable clarity despite his injuries. The big man whispered something about his family back home, about a daughter who was starting college and a wife who worried every time he deployed. Marcus assured his friend that they would all make it home, but privately he began to wonder if he was making a promise he couldn't keep. The Taliban fighters seemed to sense their opponent's weakness, pressing their attack with renewed vigor. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, enemy forces had now completely surrounded the compound, cutting off any possibility of escape on foot. Even if they could somehow break through the siege, Tank's condition made movement over rough terrain impossible. Bulldog attempted one final gambit, detonating his improvised explosives in a coordinated sequence designed to create a momentary gap in the enemy lines. The explosions were spectacular, temporarily silencing the enemy guns and creating a cloud of smoke that obscured the battlefield. But when the dust settled, fresh Taliban fighters had already moved to fill the gaps. Marcus found himself thinking about his own family as he reloaded his rifle for what might be the final time. His wife Sarah would be preparing dinner at their home in Virginia Beach, probably wondering why he hadn't called in the past few days. His son Michael was playing baseball in his senior year of high school, dreaming of following his father into the military. His daughter Emma was studying engineering at the Naval Academy, carrying on the family tradition of service. The thought of never seeing them again filled Marcus with a determination that transcended physical exhaustion and impossible odds. He had survived 15 years of special operations by never giving up, never accepting defeat, never allowing circumstances to dictate his fate. Today would be no different, regardless of what the enemy brought against him. Hassan appeared at the window of his former hideout, surveying the battle with obvious satisfaction. The Taliban commander raised what appeared to be a satellite phone to his ear, probably reporting his victory to higher-level commanders. Marcus realized that killing or capturing Hassan was no longer the primary objective. Now they were fighting simply to survive, to deny the enemy the propaganda victory they clearly expected. As the sun touched the western horizon, painting the Afghan sky in shades of orange and red, Marcus prepared for what he knew would be the enemy's final assault. His team was down to their last reserves of ammunition and strength, but they were still breathing, still fighting, still defying the odds that had been stacked against them since the mission began. The final Taliban assault came with the fury of a desert storm, overwhelming and merciless. Marcus watched through the smoke and dust as enemy fighters poured through every breach in their defensive perimeter, their war cries echoing off the compound walls like the voices of demons. This wasn't just an attack anymore. It was an execution designed to end the lives of America's finest warriors in the most public and humiliating way possible. Eagle eyes. Rifle fell silent as enemy fire concentrated on his position in the water tower. Marcus saw the sniper slump forward, his body going limp as blood began to drip from the elevated platform. The loss of Eagle Eye's covering fire opened the eastern approach, allowing Taliban fighters to advance within grenade range of their remaining positions. Marcus felt something break inside his chest, not from physical injury but from watching one of his brothers fall. Tank's breathing had become so shallow that Doc could barely detect a pulse. The medic had done everything possible with the limited resources available, but their teammate was slipping away despite all efforts to save him. Doc looked at Marcus with eyes that conveyed both professional assessment and personal anguish. Tank was dying, and there was nothing more they could do except ensure he didn't die alone. Bulldog fought like a man possessed, using his combat knife when his captured rifle ran out of ammunition. Marcus watched the demolitions expert engage 3 Taliban fighters simultaneously in the narrow corridor leading to Tank's position. Bulldog's knife work was poetry in motion, deadly and efficient, but the odds were simply too great. A burst of automatic weapons fire caught him in the chest, spinning him around before he collapsed against the concrete wall. Silent had managed to partially repair their communications equipment, but the news he received was devastating. Air support had been diverted to assist another unit under attack 20 kilometers away. No helicopters were available for extraction, and the nearest friendly ground forces were hours away. They were completely alone, fighting a battle they could not win against an enemy that showed no mercy. Marcus felt the familiar sting of shrapnel as enemy grenades exploded around his position. His left leg was bleeding heavily, and he could feel weakness creeping into his movements. But surrender wasn't an option, not just because of his training, but because he knew what the Taliban would do to captured American Special Operations Forces. Death in battle was preferable to the alternative. Doc abandoned Tank's position when it became clear their teammate was beyond help. The medic moved to Marcus's side, his face streaked with tears and gunpowder residue. He had lost 2 patients today, something that went against every instinct and training he possessed. But Doc was still a warrior, and he would fight until the end despite the professional failure that was tearing him apart. Enemy fighters had now penetrated deep into the compound, forcing Marcus and Doc to fall back to the main building where Hassan waited with obvious satisfaction. The Taliban commander had produced an expensive-looking video camera and was recording the final moments of the battle. Marcus realized this entire engagement had been orchestrated not just to kill American forces, but to create propaganda that would inspire future attacks. As Taliban fighters closed in from multiple directions, Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He pulled the pins on his 2 remaining grenades, holding them close to his body as enemy fighters approached. If they wanted to capture him alive for their propaganda videos, they would have to accept the risk of dying in the attempt. The grenades would ensure that his death and Doc's would take several Taliban fighters with them. But Doc had other ideas. The medic suddenly lunged forward, tackling Marcus and knocking the grenades from his hands. The explosives detonated harmlessly against the far wall, as Doc whispered that their families deserved better than suicide. Marcus wanted to argue, to explain that capture was worse than death, but darkness was already creeping in around the edges of his vision. The last thing Marcus remembered clearly was the sound of gunfire mixed with Hassan's voice, speaking in accented English. The Taliban commander was directing his fighters to take the Americans alive if possible, to ensure maximum propaganda value from their capture. Marcus tried to reach for his sidearm, but his hand wouldn't respond to his mental commands. Consciousness slipped away like water through his fingers. When awareness returned, Marcus found himself lying on the compound's dirt floor, his hands zip-tied behind his back, and his weapons gone. Doc lay beside him, blood seeping from a head wound but still breathing. Around them, Taliban fighters celebrated their victory with enthusiastic gunfire and religious chants. Hassan stood over them with his video camera, recording their capture for distribution. To jihadist networks worldwide, the Taliban commander explained in perfect English how this victory would inspire Muslims throughout the region to rise up against American forces. He described the torture and execution that awaited both prisoners, detailing how their deaths would be broadcast to demonstrate Taliban power and American weakness. Hassan's words were designed to break their spirit before the physical torture began. Marcus tested his restraints and found them professionally applied. The Taliban had clearly prepared for the possibility of capturing special operations forces, using proper techniques to prevent escape attempts. His legs were also bound, and he could feel the weakness in his limbs that suggested blood loss from multiple wounds. Escape seemed impossible, but his mind continued working on the problem automatically. Doc regained consciousness with a groan that drew immediate attention from their captors. Several Taliban fighters gathered around the medic, discussing his fate in rapid Pashto that Marcus couldn't understand. Hassan translated helpfully, explaining that they were debating whether to torture the medic first or save him for last. The psychological warfare was as calculated as everything else about this operation. As night fell over the compound, Marcus began to understand the true scope of Hassan's plan. This wasn't just about killing or capturing American Special Operations Forces. The Taliban commander was orchestrating a propaganda victory designed to demonstrate that even America's most elite warriors could be defeated and humiliated by determined insurgent forces. The sound of approaching vehicles filled the compound as additional Taliban forces arrived to secure their prize. Marcus counted at least 6 trucks and estimated 30 additional fighters, all eager to participate in the capture and execution of American SEALs. The celebration would continue throughout the night, building anticipation for the torture and execution that would be filmed at dawn. Hassan knelt beside Marcus, his face inches away as he described the equipment they had prepared for the torture session. The Taliban commander spoke with the enthusiasm of a man who had planned this moment for months, detailing each implement and technique they would use. The psychological torture was just beginning, designed to break their spirit before the physical pain started. Despite everything, Marcus felt his training taking over. He began cataloging every detail of their situation, looking for weaknesses in the enemy security, counting guards and noting their equipment. Even facing certain death, his mind refused to accept defeat. Somewhere in the darkness of despair, The warrior spirit that had sustained him through 15 years of special operations continued to burn, waiting for the slightest opportunity to strike back. The night stretched ahead like an eternity, filled with the sounds of enemy celebration and the promise of dawn, bringing unimaginable horror. But Marcus was still breathing, still thinking, still planning. As long as his heart continued beating, there remained the possibility of escape, rescue, or at least the chance to deny his enemies the complete victory they expected. The legend of Ghost Rodriguez wasn't finished yet, even though death seemed only hours away. The torture began before dawn, when the compound was still shrouded in pre-morning darkness. Hassan's men had spent the night preparing their equipment and building anticipation for the propaganda videos they planned to create. Marcus felt rough hands drag him from the floor and tie him to a wooden chair that had been positioned in front of bright lights and multiple cameras. Doc was forced to watch from nearby, his own restraints preventing any attempt to help his teammate. The medic's face showed the kind of anguish that came from being unable to treat suffering when every instinct demanded action. Hassan had positioned Doc specifically to maximize the psychological impact of watching Marcus endure what awaited them both. The first session lasted 3 hours and tested every aspect of Marcus's mental training. Hassan's men used techniques designed not just to extract information, but to break his spirit completely before the cameras began rolling. They wanted him reduced to a broken shell of a man, begging for mercy that would never come. But Marcus had endured survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training that prepared him for exactly this situation. Marcus gave them nothing beyond his name, rank, and service number. Each question about American military operations, base locations, or future plans was met with stony silence or carefully rehearsed responses designed to waste their time. Hassan grew increasingly frustrated as the morning wore on, realizing that breaking a Navy SEAL would require more time and creativity than anticipated. The Taliban commander brought in a specialist, a man who spoke with a refined accent and displayed knowledge of advanced interrogation techniques. This new interrogator understood psychology as well as pain, probing for emotional weaknesses that could be exploited more effectively than physical torture. He asked about Marcus's family, describing the research they had conducted on his background and personal life. The specialist knew about Sarah's job as a nurse at the Norfolk Naval Hospital, about Michael's baseball scholarship prospects, and about Emma's academic achievements at the Naval Academy. He described in vivid detail what would happen to Marcus's family when news of his capture and execution reached them. The psychological assault was more effective than any physical pain, striking at the deepest fears of a man who had devoted his life to protecting others. But Marcus had trained for this too. He forced his mind to focus on technical details, mentally reviewing weapon specifications and tactical procedures to prevent emotional responses to the interrogator's psychological probes. The technique wasn't perfect, but it provided enough mental discipline to maintain his resistance when every instinct screamed for him to cooperate, to protect his family. Doc endured his own interrogation session, the Taliban clearly hoping that medical personnel might be more susceptible to psychological pressure. The medic's training was different from Marcus's, but his core principles were identical. He gave them nothing useful, maintaining the same professional silence that had characterized their entire team throughout this ordeal. Hassan returned in the afternoon with news that reinforced the hopelessness of their situation. American forces were indeed searching for the missing SEAL team, but they were looking in the wrong location based on false intelligence the Taliban had planted. Rescue was possible in theory, but practically impossible given the deception that had led them into this trap in the first place. The Taliban commander explained his broader strategy with obvious pride. This operation was designed to demonstrate Taliban capability to defeat American Special Operations Forces through superior planning and execution. The propaganda videos would inspire recruitment and operational support throughout the region, turning their capture into a strategic victory far beyond the tactical success of the ambush itself. As the second night fell, Marcus began to understand that Hassan intended to prolong their suffering for maximum psychological impact. The quick execution he had expected wasn't part of the plan. Instead, they would endure days of torture designed to break their resistance gradually, creating video content that would demonstrate the progressive destruction of American. Resolve Doc's condition was deteriorating faster than Marcus's due to his head injury and the stress of watching his teammate suffer. The medic began showing signs of confusion and disorientation that suggested serious brain trauma requiring immediate medical attention. Marcus realized that Doc might not survive long enough to endure the extended torture Hassan had planned. During the long hours of darkness, Marcus began working on his restraints with microscopic movements that wouldn't attract attention from the guards. The zip ties were professional quality, but constant pressure applied to specific points could eventually weaken the plastic enough to create an opportunity. The process was painfully slow and probably hopeless, but it gave him something to focus on besides the pain and despair. Hassan visited them personally during the early morning hours, bringing tea and speaking casually about his background and motivation. The Taliban commander revealed that he had been educated at universities in London and Paris, trained as an engineer before returning to Afghanistan to fight the American occupation. His English was perfect because he had lived in Western countries for over a decade, studying their culture and weaknesses. The revelation explained the sophisticated planning behind their capture and the psychological techniques being employed against them. Hassan wasn't just another insurgent leader. He was an intelligent, educated man who understood both Western and Islamic cultures well enough to exploit the differences between them. This made him far more dangerous than the typical Taliban commander they had encountered in previous operations. Doc's condition worsened dramatically during the third day, his responses becoming increasingly incoherent as brain swelling progressed beyond what field medicine could address. Marcus watched helplessly as his friend slipped away gradually, knowing that proper medical treatment could save him, but that no such help would be provided. The medic who had saved so many lives was dying slowly while Marcus could only watch. Hassan seemed to understand the psychological impact of Doc's deteriorating condition, positioning cameras to record Marcus's reactions to his teammates' suffering. The Taliban commander explained that watching friends die was often more effective than personal torture, breaking resistance through emotional destruction rather than physical pain. The technique was as effective as it was cruel. By the fourth day, Marcus had managed to weaken his restraints enough to feel them give slightly when pressure was applied correctly. The process had taken every moment of concentration he could spare from resisting interrogation, and the progress was minimal. But it represented hope, the possibility that he might yet find a way to deny Hassan the complete victory he expected. Doc died on the fifth morning, his body finally succumbing to injuries that would have been treatable in any proper medical facility. Marcus felt something break inside himself as he watched his friend's last breath, a combination of grief and rage that threatened to overwhelm the mental discipline that had sustained him. Through days of captivity, the medic who had devoted his life to saving others had died because his enemies saw more value in prolonging his suffering than in showing basic human compassion. Hassan recorded Marcus's reaction to Doc's death, explaining that this footage would be particularly effective in demonstrating the emotional destruction of American fighting spirit. The Taliban commander's casual commentary about his friend's death filled Marcus with a cold fury that sharpened rather than clouded his thinking. He would find a way to make Hassan pay for what had been done here, regardless of the personal cost. The psychological torture continued, but something fundamental had changed in Marcus's resistance. Doc's death had eliminated any hope of rescue or survival, freeing him from the burden of trying to keep his teammate alive. Now he could focus entirely on escape and revenge, pursuing objectives that were probably impossible, but no longer complicated by concerns about protecting someone else. As the sixth day dawned, Marcus felt his restraints give way slightly more than before. The zip ties were finally beginning to fail after days of constant pressure applied with microscopic movements. He was still hours away from actual freedom, but the possibility now existed in reality rather than just desperate hope. Hassan had made the mistake of underestimating the determination of a man who had already lost everything that mattered to him. The escape came at 03:47 hours on the seventh day, when the guard rotation changed and Marcus had exactly 90 seconds of reduced surveillance. The zip ties finally parted after 6 days of constant pressure, freeing his hands for the first time since capture. His fingers were numb and nearly useless, but muscle memory guided them to the knife his captors had somehow missed during their initial search. The blade was small, Barely 3 inches, but it was enough. Marcus killed the first guard silently, the way he had been trained decades ago in another life that seemed impossibly distant now. The knife found its mark between the ribs, piercing the heart before the Taliban fighter could cry out. Marcus lowered the body carefully to avoid any sound that might alert other guards. Then began the agonizingly slow process of cutting through the restraints on his legs. Moving through the compound required every skill he had learned during 15 years of special operations. His body was broken, weakened by days of torture and blood loss, but his mind remained sharp with the clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. Each step was planned and executed with the precision of a ghost moving through enemy territory. Just as he had earned his nickname years ago, Hassan's security had grown complacent after 6 days of successful captivity. The guards had settled into predictable patterns, confident that their broken prisoner posed no threat to their overwhelming numerical superiority. They had forgotten that wounded predators are often the most dangerous, capable of summoning reserves of strength and cunning that transcend physical limitations. Marcus found Hassan in the main building, reviewing torture footage with obvious satisfaction, while planning the final execution video that would complete his propaganda victory. The Taliban commander looked up with surprise that quickly transformed into fear as he recognized the ghost-like figure standing in his doorway. Marcus moved with the fluid grace of a warrior who had accepted death and therefore feared nothing. The fight was brief but intensely personal. Hassan reached for his sidearm, but Marcus was already moving, covering the distance between them faster than seemed possible for a man in his condition. The knife that had killed his guard found Hassan's throat with surgical precision, opening the major arteries while preventing any cry for help that might alert other fighters. Hassan died staring into Marcus's eyes, finally understanding that he had underestimated the spirit of the man he thought he had broken. The Taliban commander's last expression was one of disbelief that his carefully planned victory had been turned into crushing defeat by the determination of a single American warrior who refused to accept the impossible. Marcus destroyed every piece of electronic equipment in Hassan's command center, ensuring that no record of their capture and torture would survive to inspire future attacks. The propaganda victory Hassan had planned became instead a testament to the unbreakable spirit of American Special Operations Forces, though Marcus knew this version of the story would never be widely told. Moving through the compound toward the perimeter required skills that transcended training and entered the realm of pure instinct. Marcus's body was operating on reserves he didn't know he possessed, driven by a combination of duty and vengeance that made him more dangerous than he had ever been in perfect health. Each Taliban fighter he encountered died quickly and silently, clearing a path toward freedom that seemed impossible just hours before. The alarm was finally raised when Hassan's body was discovered, but by then Marcus had already reached the compound's outer wall. The pursuing Taliban fighters found only shadows and the bodies of their comrades, evidence that their broken prisoner had transformed into something far more deadly than they had ever imagined. The hunt that followed would become the stuff of legend throughout the region. Marcus moved through the Afghan mountains like the ghost he had always been, covering ground that should have been impossible for a man in his condition. His injuries were severe, his strength was failing, but his will remained unbroken. Behind him, Taliban forces launched the largest manhunt in the region's history, determined to recapture or kill the American who had humiliated them so completely. The pursuit continued for 3 days across terrain that tested every survival skill Marcus had ever learned. He moved by night and hid during the day, using techniques perfected during years of operations in similar environments. His body was failing, but his mind remained focused on the single objective of reaching friendly forces before his strength gave out completely. On the third night, Marcus heard the distinctive sound of American helicopters approaching from the northeast. Intelligence gathered from Hassan's equipment had finally provided search teams with accurate information about the missing SEAL team's location. The rescue force had been deployed immediately upon learning that one member might still be alive and attempting escape. The helicopter crews found Marcus collapsed on a rocky hillside, barely conscious but still breathing after an ordeal that would have killed most men. He was evacuated immediately to the nearest field hospital, where military medical personnel began the long process of treating injuries that amazed them with their severity. The fact that he had survived, much less escaped, seemed to defy medical explanation. News of Marcus's survival and escape spread throughout the special operations community like wildfire, becoming an instant legend that would inspire future generations of warriors. The story was classified at the highest levels, but word of his incredible endurance and determination reached every corner of the military establishment. Ghost Rodriguez had become more than a nickname. It was now a symbol of unbreakable spirit. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Hassan's operation and the sophisticated intelligence network that had made the ambush possible. Marcus's escape had not only saved his own life, but it also provided crucial intelligence that led to the dismantling of Taliban networks throughout the region. His survival had turned a devastating defeat into a strategic victory. Marcus spent 6 months recovering from his physical injuries, but the psychological wounds ran deeper and healed more slowly. The loss of his team haunted him daily, though he gradually came to understand that their sacrifice had not been in vain. His escape and the intelligence it provided had prevented similar attacks and saved countless American lives. When the SEALs arrived at the hospital to visit their legendary teammate, they found a man forever changed by his ordeal, but still possessing the unbreakable spirit that had carried him through the darkest moments of human endurance. Marcus Rodriguez had proven that legends are not born from perfection, but from the refusal to surrender when surrender seems like the only rational choice. The broken, bloodied warrior who had been left for dead in an Afghan compound had not only survived but had turned his enemy's greatest victory into their most crushing defeat. When the SEALs arrived to bring him home, the legend still drew breath, and his story became an eternal reminder that the human spirit, when properly trained and motivated, knows no boundaries that cannot be overcome.